Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Marcus Holloway, and 6 months ago, I believed that maps could be trusted. That the world, once measured and documented, stayed precisely where you left it. I made my living as a private cartographer, one of the last people still doing survey work by hand for wealthy clients who wanted something more personal than satellite imagery, custom property maps, estate boundaries, historical recreations. It was niche work, the kind that paid well enough to sustain my small apartment in Portland and my collection of antique surveying equipment. The kind of work where attention to detail wasn't just appreciated, it was essential. I'd been doing it for 11 years when I received the commission that would unravel everything I thought I understood about permanence and place. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, forwarded through my website's contact form. The sender identified himself as Dr. Raymond Iskov, a name that meant nothing to me then, but would come to occupy an uncomfortable space in my thoughts. He wrote in the formal, slightly stilted manner of someone unused to casual digital communication, explaining that he'd acquired a property in Central Oregon, a research station that had been abandoned since the early 1990s and needed comprehensive surveying and mapping before beginning renovations. The pay he offered was exceptional, almost absurdly so, enough to cover 3 months of my usual income. He included coordinates, a brief historical overview, and a request that I complete the work within 2 weeks. The coordinates placed the property roughly 40 miles southeast of Bend, in a region where the Cascade foothills dissolved into high desert scrubland. I pulled up satellite imagery that evening, zooming into the lonely stretch of geography he'd indicated. The images were surprisingly poor quality for that area, pixelated and unclear, with what appeared to be cloud cover or atmospheric distortion obscuring large sections. I could make out what might have been structures, rectilinear shadows that suggested buildings, but little else. The surrounding landscape was desolate, characterized by juniper scrub and basalt formations, the kind of terrain that looked the same in every direction. I should have found the image quality strange, should have questioned why a property so recently abandoned would be so difficult to see from above. But the money was compelling, and I'd worked in difficult terrain before. Besides, I told myself satellite imagery could be unreliable in certain atmospheric conditions, particularly in regions with unusual mineral deposits or electromagnetic interference. I responded with my standard contract terms, requested an advance, and began preparing my equipment. Dr. Iskov's reply came within an hour, which seemed unnaturally prompt given the time stamp suggested he'd sent it at 3 in the morning. He agreed to all my terms without negotiation, transferred the advance immediately, and included a PDF attachment labeled Historical Context, Redstone Research Station. I opened it while eating a late dinner, expecting the usual dry property history, previous ownership records, maybe some architectural plans. What I found instead was a document that felt more like a confession than a briefing. The Redstone Research Station, according to Dr. Iskov's document, had been established in 1967 by the Department of the Interior, ostensibly as a geological survey outpost studying volcanic activity and mineral formations in the region. The station had operated continuously for 23 years, staffed by rotating teams of geologists, seismologists, and technical support personnel. Then, in August 1990, it had been abruptly decommissioned following what the document vaguely described as catastrophic equipment failure and data corruption. The facility had been sealed but not demolished, left to the desert as if the very act of dismantling it might prove dangerous. Dr. Iskov had acquired the property through what he called governmental surplus channels, a phrase that suggested bureaucratic complexity I didn't want to understand. He intended to convert the station into a private research facility. His field was geophysics, apparently, but first needed accurate surveys to determine structural integrity and plan renovations. The existing architectural plans, he noted, were unreliable and potentially compromised by data corruption during the original decommissioning. I remember pausing over that phrase, data corruption. It seemed an odd way to describe architectural plans, which were typically drafted on paper in the 1960s, not stored digitally. But I filed the observation away as academic peculiarity and continued reading. The document included a grainy photograph from 1989, showing the station from an aerial perspective. I could make out 5 main structures arranged in a rough pentagonal configuration around a central courtyard, connected by covered walkways. The buildings were utilitarian, government tissue construction, flat-roofed and anonymous. Nothing about them suggested anything unusual, just the standard institutional architecture of mid-century government facilities. The last page of the document contained what Dr. Iskov called operational notes, a list of practical considerations for anyone working on the property. Most were mundane. The nearest town was Milliken, 37 miles west. Cell phone reception was non-existent. I should bring my own water and supplies for the duration of my stay. But 3 items stood out. Due to residual electromagnetic interference from previous research activities, electronic equipment may experience anomalous behavior. Mechanical surveying tools are recommended. The facility's original survey markers remain in place, but may have shifted due to seismic activity. Independent verification of all measurements is essential. Interior spaces should be documented, but not extensively explored without proper safety equipment. Some areas may remain contaminated with research materials. I read these notes 3 times, trying to determine if they should concern me more than they did. The electromagnetic interference explained the poor satellite imagery, at least. The shifted survey markers were unusual but not impossible in a seismically active region. The contamination warning was vague, but probably referred to chemical or biological hazards, common enough in abandoned research facilities. What I should have focused on was the phrase, may have shifted. Survey markers were typically concrete or metal installations driven deep into bedrock, designed specifically to resist movement. The idea that multiple markers would shift suggested either extraordinary seismic activity or something fundamentally wrong with the underlying geology. But I didn't focus on that. Instead, I forwarded the document to my insurance company, updated my liability coverage, and began packing. I left Portland on a Sunday morning, driving my aging Subaru southeast toward Bend. The weather was overcast, typical for early spring in the Pacific Northwest, with low clouds pressing down on the forested mountains of the Cascades. I'd made this drive dozens of times for various projects, enough that the progression of landscapes felt familiar. The gradual shift from wet Douglas fir forests to drier ponderosa pine, then to the juniper and sagebrush of the high desert. It was a transition I usually found soothing, a physical manifestation of leaving urban complexity behind for the clarity of open spaces and technical work. This time, the transition felt different somehow, more abrupt, as if the boundaries between ecosystems had grown sharper, less gradual. I noticed it first crossing the mountains, where the forest seemed to end too suddenly, giving way to almost treeless slopes that should have been gradual transitional zones. Later, descending toward Bend, the ponderosa forests appeared too uniform, lacking the natural variation of healthy woodlands. These were subtle wrongnesses, the kind that could be explained by selective logging or management practices, but they accumulated in my awareness like static charge. I stopped for gas in Bend and asked the attendant about Redstone Research Station. He was young, maybe 22, with the weathered hands of someone who worked outdoors regularly. He shook his head slowly when I mentioned the name. "Don't know it," he said, "but there's weird shit out that way. Government land mostly. My uncle used to hunt out there before they closed it off. Said the landscape played tricks on you, made you think you were somewhere you weren't." "Closed it off when?" I asked. He shrugged. "Long time ago, 80s maybe, before I was born." I paid for gas and coffee, adding a detailed road atlas to my purchases. The atlas showed the area I was headed to as largely blank, marked only with contour lines and the occasional dirt road designation. No landmarks, no place names except Milliken, which appeared as a tiny dot with a population listed as 12. The drive from Bend took 2 hours, the last 90 minutes on progressively deteriorating roads. I followed Dr. Iskov's directions, turning onto Forest Service Road 2270 and following it southeast until the pavement ended, replaced by graded gravel that eventually became merely 2 ruts through scrubland. The landscape grew increasingly desolate, juniper and sagebrush giving way to exposed basalt and volcanic ash. The sky remained overcast, but the light had a peculiar quality, flat and directionless, that made distances difficult to judge. I should have been consulting my GPS, but I'd lost satellite signal 20 miles back, which aligned with Dr. Iskov's warning about electromagnetic interference. Instead, I relied on my odometer and compass, old-fashioned navigation that felt appropriate for the isolation. The road, if it could still be called that, curved around a low basalt ridge, and that's when I first saw Redstone Research Station. It sat in a shallow depression, sheltered from prevailing winds by the ridge and an opposing rise of volcanic rock. The 5 buildings Dr. Iskov had mentioned were indeed arranged in a pentagonal formation, though from this angle they seemed skewed somehow, as if viewed through distorting glass. They were larger than the photograph had suggested, 2 stories tall with metal siding that had weathered to a uniform rust brown. The covered walkways connecting them were partially collapsed, skeletal metal frameworks exposed where roofing material had blown away. What struck me immediately was how intact everything looked despite decades of abandonment. No broken windows, no obvious structural damage, no graffiti or signs of vandalism. The buildings simply stood there, patient and weathered, as if waiting for something. I parked near what appeared to be the main entrance of the northernmost building, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The wind had died completely, which seemed impossible in this exposed landscape. No bird calls, no insect sounds, just an absence of noise that felt almost textured, as if silence itself had become a presence. The air when I stepped out tasted of alkaline dust and something else, something metallic and organic simultaneously, like old pennies left in stagnant water. The temperature was cooler than it should have been for this elevation and season, cool enough that I could see my breath misting slightly. I walked to the rear of my Subaru and began unloading equipment. My transit theodolite, measuring chains, stakes, field books, the mechanical tools I'd brought in deference to Dr. Iskov's electromagnetic warning. The station's entrance was secured with a modern padlock, incongruous against the weathered metal door. Dr. Iskov had provided a key, which I retrieved from an envelope marked Primary Access. Building A, the lock opened smoothly, too smoothly for something exposed to desert weather for decades, and the door swung inward with barely a sound. The interior was darker than it should have been. The building had windows, I could see them from outside, but somehow their light didn't penetrate far into the entrance corridor. I flicked on my flashlight, battery powered, thankfully unaffected by whatever electromagnetic phenomenon plagued the area, and the beam revealed a hallway that extended deeper than the building's external dimensions should have allowed. I've spent enough time surveying buildings to develop an instinctive sense of spatial relationships, an ability to estimate interior volumes from exterior dimensions. This corridor was wrong. The building was perhaps 60 feet deep from front to back, but the hallway seemed to continue for at least 80 feet before terminating in what looked like a junction with cross corridors. I told myself it was an optical illusion, a trick of perspective in the poor light. I told myself that I'd take actual measurements and the discrepancy would resolve itself. I told myself a lot of things in those first minutes that I would later recognize as the mind's desperate attempt to maintain its familiar frameworks. The corridor walls were institutional beige, marked with the rectangular shadows where bulletin boards or notices had once hung. The floor was concrete, surprisingly clean given the desertion, showing only a fine layer of dust that my boots disturbed into swirling patterns. Doors lined both sides of the corridor at regular intervals, each marked with faded placards. Sample storage. Equipment room 3. Seismic analysis laboratory. I chose to begin with exterior surveying, establishing the perimeter before attempting interior mapping. This was standard procedure, and I clung to standard procedure the way drowning people cling to debris. I returned to my car, loaded my equipment onto a wheeled cart I'd brought for the purpose, and began the methodical work of establishing a primary survey network. The station's pentagonal layout meant I needed to establish at least 5 control points, one at each corner. I started at the northeast corner of Building A, setting up my theodolite and searching for the original survey markers Dr. Iskov had mentioned. According to the historical plans he provided, a bronze marker should have been embedded in bedrock approximately 3 feet from the building's foundation. I found it, but not where it should have been. The marker was present, inscribed with USGS identification codes and the date 1967, but it was positioned nearly 8 feet from the foundation, not 3. I double-checked the plans, confirmed my starting position, and measured again. 8 feet, with less than an inch of error. The marker had moved, or the building had, or the bedrock itself had somehow shifted in ways that violated my understanding of geological processes. I documented the discrepancy in my field book, noting the exact measurements and my observations, then moved to the next corner. The pattern repeated. Every survey marker was displaced from its documented position, but not uniformly. Some had shifted by 6 feet, others by 10, in directions that seemed to follow no pattern I could identify. It was as if the entire station had been picked up, rotated slightly, and set down imperfectly, with each building and marker displaced by different amounts. This should have been impossible. Survey markers don't migrate 8 feet through solid basalt. Buildings don't shift on their foundations without showing catastrophic structural damage. Yet here was the evidence, documented in my field book with precise measurements that made no sense. I spent the rest of that first day establishing a new survey network, driving stakes and creating my own control points that I could verify and trust. The work was absorbing enough that I could almost ignore the growing collection of inconsistencies. The way shadows fell at angles that didn't quite match the sun's position. The manner in which sound seemed to travel too far in some directions and not far enough in others. The persistent wrongness of the temperature, which dropped steadily as the day progressed despite clear skies and strong sunlight. By 4 in the afternoon, I'd completed the exterior perimeter survey and begun creating a detailed site plan. The buildings, when measured carefully and plotted on graph paper, revealed another impossibility. Their external dimensions, taken from multiple angles and verified repeatedly, exceeded the internal dimensions I'd estimated from my brief venture into Building A. This wasn't a subtle discrepancy like the shifted markers. This was a fundamental violation of spatial logic. The building was larger on the outside than on the inside. Or rather, I realized with a cold clarity that made my hands shake slightly as I recorded the measurements. The interior was smaller than it should be, compressed somehow, as if the external structure contained less space than its volume implied. I sat on the tailgate of my Subaru as the sun began its descent, eating an energy bar that tasted like sawdust and reviewing my notes. Every measurement I'd taken was precise, verified multiple times with different instruments to eliminate equipment error. Yet the accumulated data described something geometrically impossible, a facility that had migrated from its original position, whose buildings violated basic spatial relationships, where survey markers had wandered through solid rock like slow sleepwalkers. The rational explanation, the one I desperately wanted to embrace, was that the original documentation was wrong, that the 1967 plans I was working from contained errors, that the survey markers had been improperly installed, that my spatial estimation in the corridor had been mistaken. But I'd been doing this work for 11 years. I knew documentation accuracy, knew installation standards, knew my own skills. The errors would have to be profound and systematic to account for what I was observing. The alternative explanation, the one I was beginning to feel pressing against my awareness like cold water seeping through a failing dam, was that something about this place fundamentally violated the rules I'd spent my professional life trusting. I decided to spend the night in my car rather than the 20-mile drive back to the nearest motel in Milliken. I had a sleeping bag, supplies, and the irrational but powerful feeling that leaving before I understood what I was observing would be a form of cowardice. I also wanted to observe the facility at night, to see if darkness revealed anything the harsh desert sunlight had concealed. As twilight deepened, I walked the perimeter again, this time without equipment, just observing. The buildings seemed to settle into the landscape differently as light failed, their edges becoming less distinct, as if the boundary between structure and environment was negotiable rather than fixed. The connecting walkways, skeletal in daylight, became almost invisible, leaving the 5 buildings as dark geometric forms arranged around an empty center. That's when I noticed the lights. They were faint, barely visible against the deepening blue of the evening sky, emanating from windows in Building C, the structure on the facility's western edge. Not the harsh fluorescent glow of functioning electrical systems, but something dimmer, more organic like bioluminescence or foxfire. The lights pulsed slowly, irregularly, with a rhythm that felt almost respiratory. I stood watching them for perhaps 10 minutes, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Electrical systems couldn't function after 30 years without maintenance. The facility had been sealed, Dr. Iskov had said, with all power disconnected. Yet there was illumination, undeniable and impossible, breathing in the windows of an abandoned building. I should have investigated immediately. Should have grabbed my flashlight and entered Building C to identify the source. But something in the quality of that light triggered a response deeper than curiosity. Something primitive that recognized a warning when it saw one. Instead, I returned to my car, locked the doors with a futility I recognized even as I did it, and sat watching the lights pulse until exhaustion overcame unease and I slept. I dreamed of maps that changed as I drew them, of surveying equipment that gave different measurements each time I looked through the lens, of walking through corridors that led back to where I'd started regardless of direction. In the dream, Dr. Iskov appeared, not as I'd imagined him, but as a figure composed entirely of survey markers and measuring chains, speaking in coordinates that described locations impossible to reach. I woke before dawn, stiff and cold, to find the lights in Building C extinguished. Morning revealed the facility exactly as I'd left it, weathered, patient, wrong. I made coffee on my camp stove, ate a protein bar, and made a decision that felt both inevitable and foolish. I would enter Building C and investigate the lights. Not because I expected to find a rational explanation, but because the alternative, continuing to work around the mystery, pretending I could map this place without understanding what it fundamentally was, seemed impossible. The key Dr. Iskov had provided for Building A worked on Building C's entrance as well, which suggested either universal keying or that he'd known I would need access to all structures. The door, like Building A's, opened too smoothly, revealing another corridor that extended further than it should. This time I was prepared for the spatial wrongness. I'd brought measuring tape, chalk for marking distances, and a ball of string I could use to verify my path. The corridor was similar to Building A's, institutional beige walls, concrete floors, regularly spaced doors. But the air here was different, denser somehow, carrying that same metallic organic scent I'd noticed outside but stronger, almost overwhelming. I marked the entrance with chalk, then began measuring the corridor in 10-foot increments, marking each distance and noting it in my field book. After 60 feet, I should have reached the end of the building based on my exterior measurements. Instead, the corridor continued, bending slightly to the left in a curve so gradual I might not have noticed without careful observation. I followed the curve, continuing to measure and mark. 70 feet, 80, 90. The corridor should have ended long ago, should have intersected with the building's rear wall. Instead, it curved further, the bend becoming more pronounced, until I realized with a disorienting clarity that I was walking in a very large circle, one that couldn't possibly fit within the building's external dimensions. I stopped at the 100-foot mark and looked back the way I'd come. The entrance was no longer visible. The corridor extended in both directions, curving away into distance that shouldn't exist. My chalk marks were still present, spaced at regular intervals, but they seemed too far apart now, as if the space between them had expanded. That's when I heard the sound. It came from somewhere ahead, from the direction the corridor curved. A rhythmic clicking that reminded me of surveying equipment being adjusted, metal on metal in precise increments. I stood perfectly still, hardly breathing, trying to locate the sound's origin. It continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving only the thick silence that seemed characteristic of this place. I should have retreated then, should have followed my string back to the entrance and left Building C entirely. But I'd spent 11 years developing professional thoroughness, and thoroughness demanded I investigate the sound source. I continued forward, moving more slowly now, aware that I was making a choice that might have profound consequences. The corridor's curve gradually straightened, opening into a junction where 4 hallways met at right angles. The space was larger than the others I'd seen, perhaps 20 feet square, with a ceiling that rose higher than standard building codes would specify. In the center of the junction sat a piece of equipment I recognized, a Wild T2 theodolite, a surveying instrument from the 1960s, mounted on a tripod that had been bolted directly to the concrete floor. I approached it carefully, examining it without touching. The theodolite was in remarkably good condition for its age, its brass fittings clean of oxidation, its optics clear. Someone had been using it recently, or at least maintaining it. Fresh scrapes marked the concrete around the tripod's feet, suggesting it had been adjusted or repositioned within the last few days. I looked through the eyepiece, expecting to see the distorted view of a misaligned instrument. Instead, I saw a perfect, focused image of the corridor behind me, the one I just walked through, but changed. In the theodolite's view, the corridor was occupied. A figure stood approximately 40 feet back, motionless, facing my direction. The image was too small and too distant for me to make out details, but the posture suggested someone waiting, observing. I pulled back from the eyepiece and turned quickly. The corridor was empty. I looked through the theodolite again, and the figure remained, unchanged, patient. I stepped away from the instrument entirely, my heart accelerating in a way that made my hands tremble slightly. The theodolite was showing me something that wasn't there, or something that was there but invisible to direct observation. Or, and this possibility felt most correct despite its impossibility, it was showing me the corridor as it existed in some other configuration, some other version of space that occupied the same location but remained separated by boundaries I didn't understand. I backed away from the junction, keeping the theodolite in view, and collided with something that shouldn't have been there. I spun, instinctively raising my hands, and found myself facing a bulletin board that I was certain hadn't been present moments before. It was mounted on the wall adjacent to the junction, exactly where I just walked, bearing a collection of documents pinned beneath yellowed plastic covers. The documents were survey reports, dated between 1987 and 1990, documenting something called Spatial Integrity Project, Phase III measurements. I pulled one free and read by flashlight, my hands still unsteady. The report described systematic surveying of the facility's interior spaces, conducted at monthly intervals, noting progressive discrepancies between expected and measured dimensions. The language was technical, clinical, but the underlying message was clear. The station's interior geometry was unstable, expanding and contracting in ways that defied physical law. The surveyor, identified as Gerald Kimmer, noted that architectural boundaries appear increasingly permeable, with adjacent spaces demonstrating fluid connectivity impossible under standard dimensional constraints. The final report, dated August 12, 1990, 3 days before the station's official decommissioning, was less clinical. Kimmer wrote, "Interior spaces no longer correspond to any external reference frame. Measurements taken at the same location, 6 hours apart, differ by margins that cannot be attributed to equipment error or procedural inconsistency. The facility is no longer occupying space in any conventional sense. Recommend immediate evacuation and permanent sealing. Further investigation risks personnel becoming lost in topologies that may not reliably connect to standard dimensional framework." Below this, someone had written in pen, "Recommendation rejected. Research continues until primary objectives achieved. R.I. Raymond Iskov." I stood in that impossible junction, holding documents that described exactly what I was experiencing, and felt the last of my comfortable assumptions about reality crack and separate. Dr. Iskov hadn't hired me to map the station. He'd hired me to verify something he already knew, that the spatial anomalies Kimmer had documented 33 years ago were still present, still active, possibly still expanding. The clicking sound resumed, closer now, coming from the corridor to my left. I turned toward it and saw, with a clarity that left no room for doubt or rationalization, that the corridor was longer than it had been moments before. Not by measurement error or optical illusion, but by actual physical extension, as if space itself was growing, budding new distance into existence. The figure I'd seen through the theodolite stood at the far end of this new length, no longer distant and indistinct, but close enough that I could make out details. It was human-shaped but wrong in subtle ways, proportions slightly off, movements too fluid, as if gravity affected it differently. It raised one arm, and I realized it was holding surveying equipment, a measuring chain that extended from its hand into the wall beside it, passing through solid concrete, as if the boundary between object and environment had become negotiable. I ran. The decision was instinctive, bypassing all rational process, triggering responses that predated consciousness. I ran back the way I'd come, following my string and chalk marks, aware that the corridor was changing around me even as I fled through it. Distances contracted and expanded, walls shifted their angles, doors appeared and disappeared. I kept my eyes on my markers, using them as anchors in topology that no longer respected consistency. I burst through Building C's entrance into morning sunlight that felt like absolution, stumbling into the courtyard and colliding with my surveying cart, which I'd left near the entrance. I stood there gasping, hands on knees, waiting for my heart to slow from its panicked acceleration. When I could breathe normally again, I looked back at Building C from outside. It appeared exactly as it had before, weathered, 2 stories tall, perhaps 60 feet deep. Nothing about its external appearance suggested the impossible spaces it contained, the corridors that curved through dimensions that shouldn't exist, the figures that moved through its interior following rules I didn't understand. I spent the rest of that day in my car, reviewing Kimmer's reports and trying to construct a framework that could accommodate what I'd experienced. The reports were thorough, detailing 3 years of progressive spatial destabilization, each measurement cycle documenting expansion of the facility's interior volume despite unchanged external dimensions. Kimmer had mapped the phenomenon carefully, creating diagrams that showed interior spaces ballooning outward in ways that violated Euclidean geometry, forming pockets and extensions that couldn't exist within the building's physical constraints. The final report included a hand-drawn diagram that I studied for hours, trying to understand its implications. It showed the 5 buildings arranged in their pentagonal formation, but connected by something beneath, a network of spaces that existed between or below the structures, accessible through what Kimmer called dimensional permeability zones. He'd marked these zones with careful measurements, noting that they appeared to expand during certain times of day, particularly during twilight transitions, creating temporary passages between spaces that were ordinarily separated. Dr. Iskov's note, "Research continues until primary objectives achieved," suggested that the spatial anomalies weren't a disaster to be contained, but a phenomenon to be studied, possibly even encouraged. The station hadn't been sealed because of equipment failure, as the official documentation claimed. It had been sealed because whatever research was being conducted had succeeded too well, creating instabilities that made the facility dangerous or impossible to navigate using conventional spatial assumptions. And now Dr. Iskov, 33 years later, wanted it mapped again, wanted verification that the anomalies persisted, wanted documentation of how the phenomenon had progressed in 3 decades of isolation. I was being used as an instrument to measure something that violated the fundamental principles of my profession. The question was whether I would continue, knowing what I now knew, or whether I would abandon the commission and leave this place to its impossible geometry. The rational choice was obvious. I should have packed my equipment, driven back to Portland, returned Dr. Iskov's advance, and forgotten about Redstone Research Station. But rationality, I was learning, was itself a convention that this place had stopped observing. And there was something compelling about the mystery, something that appealed to the part of me that had chosen cartography, because I loved the process of transforming chaos into order, of making sense of complicated landscapes through careful measurement and documentation. If the station was violating spatial conventions, then perhaps it could be mapped using different conventions. Perhaps Kimmer's failure had been assuming that Euclidean geometry was the only framework available. Perhaps what I was observing required a different approach, one that acknowledged the possibility of spaces that existed in multiple configurations simultaneously, that curved through dimensions I couldn't directly perceive but could measure through their effects. I spent that evening reading everything I could find about non-Euclidean geometry, topology, and spatial mathematics, using my phone's downloaded reference library since I had no internet connectivity. I wasn't a mathematician, but I understood principles, how spherical geometry operated on curved surfaces, how hyperbolic geometry described spaces where parallel lines diverged, how topological transformations could reshape spaces while preserving certain fundamental relationships. The station wasn't behaving randomly. Kimmer's reports made that clear. The spatial expansion followed patterns, responded to temporal cycles, concentrated around specific locations. It was consistent enough that it could be measured, which meant it could potentially be mapped if I used the right tools and approaches. By the time darkness fell again, I decided to continue. Not because the money was compelling, though it remained so, but because walking away felt like admitting defeat, acknowledging that some landscapes were too strange to document, some spaces too wrong to understand. And I'd spent my entire adult life believing that any space, no matter how complex, could be reduced to marks on paper that captured its essential truth. The lights in Building C returned with twilight, pulsing with that same slow rhythm. but now I understood them differently, not as impossible electrical phenomena, but as indicators of dimensional permeability, marking times when the boundaries between ordinary space and whatever extended space the station occupied became thin enough for light to bleed through. I set up my theodolite in the courtyard, positioning it to observe Building C's windows and watch the light cycle through its pattern. It wasn't random. The pulse had a period of approximately 47 seconds, with slight variations that seemed to correlate with something. I lacked instruments to measure whatever environmental factor influenced the variation, but it was present, consistent, measurable. I documented the pattern carefully, creating a timeline that showed light intensity varying in waves that suggested some kind of interference pattern, as if multiple sources were overlapping, creating areas of reinforcement and cancellation. After 3 hours of observation, I had enough data to construct a preliminary model, one that suggested the lights were responding to something deeper than simple electrical activity. They were reflections or projections of spatial relationships. I couldn't directly observe, visible indicators of the station's impossible interior geography. The figure I'd seen through the theodolite in Building C appeared in the windows occasionally, never for more than a few seconds, always in different windows, as if moving through the building following pathways that didn't correspond to any corridors I'd observed. Each time it appeared, I noted its location and timestamp, gradually building a map of its movements. The pattern that emerged was disturbing in its implications. The figure was traversing the building in ways that required it to pass through walls, to appear in spaces that couldn't be connected by ordinary corridors, to move between floors without using stairs or elevators. It was navigating the building's extended topology, the impossible spaces that existed within or beneath or beside the conventional structure, following routes that were invisible to me, but apparently accessible to whatever it was, or whoever, because I was beginning to suspect that the figure wasn't some manifestation of the spatial anomaly, but another person, someone who understood the station's altered geometry well enough to move through it deliberately, someone who had been here long enough to learn its rules, to map its permeable boundaries, to exist within its impossible spaces as comfortably as I existed in normal ones. Someone who had perhaps never left when the station was sealed in 1990. I slept poorly that night, waking frequently to check the windows, to verify that the figure was still moving through Building C's interior, still following its incomprehensible patterns. Each time I woke, I found it present, patient, continuing its circuit through spaces that shouldn't exist. Morning arrived with the same flat, directionless light I'd observed the previous day. I made coffee, forced myself to eat, and retrieved Kimmer's reports from my car. If someone had remained in the station since its decommissioning, then Kimmer's diagrams might show where they were living, what spaces they were occupying. The dimensional permeability zones he'd identified would be the most stable areas, the places where extended and normal space overlapped consistently enough to allow reliable navigation. I spread the diagrams on my car's hood, weighing the corners with rocks to prevent desert wind from scattering them. Kimmer had identified 7 primary permeability zones, marked with careful coordinates and notes about their temporal stability. 5 were located at what he called structural nexus points, places where the building's foundations intersected with underlying geological features, basalt formations that seemed to anchor or focus the spatial anomalies. The other 2 were in the courtyard, in areas where multiple buildings' influence overlapped. I walked to the nearest courtyard permeability zone, marked on Kimmer's diagram as PZ6, high stability persistent dimensional bridge. The location was unremarkable, just a patch of concrete perhaps 10 feet across, slightly discolored compared to the surrounding surface. I knelt, examining the concrete more carefully, and found what I was looking for, a survey marker, smaller than the ones at the building's corners, inscribed with coordinates and the designation PZ6 anchor. I set up my theodolite directly over the marker, aligned it carefully, and began taking measurements to the surrounding buildings. The angles were wrong, not by small margins that could be attributed to equipment error or shifting foundations, but by degrees that indicated the buildings weren't where they appeared to be. Or more accurately, they were occupying multiple positions simultaneously, their actual locations differing from their apparent ones by distances that ranged from inches to several feet. I was observing something that I'd encountered in abstract mathematical contexts, but never expected to see in physical reality: superposition, the simultaneous occupation of multiple states or positions. The buildings existed in their apparent locations, visible and solid, but they also existed elsewhere, displaced by the spatial anomalies, occupying extended spaces that curved away from conventional geometry into configurations I couldn't directly perceive. The theodolite, like the one I'd found in Building C, was showing me something closer to the truth than direct observation could reveal. Through its lenses, aligned over the permeability zone marker, I could see the buildings as they actually existed, not as they appeared. And what I saw was profoundly disorienting. Building C, viewed through the theodolite from this position, appeared to shimmer, its edges uncertain, as if I were seeing it through heat distortion. But it wasn't heat. The morning air was cool and still. It was spatial uncertainty, the building occupying a probability distribution of positions rather than a single fixed location. As I watched, the shimmer resolved briefly into multiple overlapping images, like a photograph with severe motion blur, showing the building in several positions at once, separated by distances of perhaps 10 or 15 feet. I adjusted the theodolite's focus, trying to isolate one of these phantom positions, and that's when I saw the additional structures. Between and behind the visible buildings, occupying spaces that should have been empty courtyard, were other structures, ghostly, translucent, but undeniably present. They had the same utilitarian architecture as the visible buildings, the same weathered metal siding, but they existed in what I can only describe as parallel positions, sharing the same general location, but offset into dimensions I couldn't name. Through the theodolite, I could count at least 3 additional buildings for every visible one, creating a layered architecture that was far more extensive than the simple 5-building pentagon I'd been surveying. This was what Kimmer had been measuring. This was why the interior spaces were larger than external dimensions should allow. Because the buildings extended through these parallel positions, their interiors connected through the dimensional permeability zones, creating a complex topology that appeared simple from any single observational frame, but was actually vastly more complicated. And somewhere within this extended architecture, someone was living, moving through the spaces with familiarity, navigating between positions the way I navigated between rooms. I spent the next 6 hours systematically surveying from each of the 7 permeability zones Kimmer had identified, documenting what I observed through the theodolite from each position. The work was exhausting, not physically but mentally, requiring me to hold in my mind spatial relationships that violated every intuition I developed about how space behaved. I filled 3 field books with measurements, observations, sketches of the overlapping structures I could see through the theodolite's lens. By early afternoon, I had enough data to begin constructing a map. Not a conventional map, but something more like a layered transparency, showing the station's multiple spatial configurations stacked atop each other, connected by the permeability zones. I worked on the hood of my car, using translucent vellum sheets and colored pencils to create each layer, then aligning them to show how the structures overlapped and diverged. The resulting map was unlike anything I'd ever created. It showed Redstone Research Station not as a single facility, but as a nested series of facilities, each occupying the same general location, but offset along axes I couldn't define. The 5 visible buildings appeared on the top layer, but beneath them were 15 more structures, arranged in increasingly complex patterns that suggested some kind of geometric progression or fractal expansion. The permeability zones appeared as connection points between layers, places where the boundaries thinned enough that someone could move from one spatial configuration to another. And threaded through all of it, marked on my map as a dotted line following pathways I'd extrapolated from the figure's movements, was a route, a circuit through the station's extended topology that touched all 7 permeability zones and visited structures on at least 4 different layers. Someone had established this route deliberately, maintaining it over years or decades. Someone who understood the station's geometry intimately, who could navigate its impossibilities as reliably as I could navigate a city street grid. I needed to find them, not out of curiosity, though that was present, but because they represented the only source of information about how to safely navigate this place, how to complete my survey without becoming lost in topologies that might not reliably connect back to the normal spatial framework I called home. The route I'd mapped passed through Building C, which I'd already entered, and Building A, which I had keys for. But it also required traversing the courtyard permeability zones, moving between spatial layers in ways I didn't understand. I decided to attempt following the route, using Kimmer's reports and my own observations to guide me, hoping that direct experience would clarify what abstract mapping couldn't fully capture. I waited for twilight, watching as the light in Building C's windows began their slow pulse. According to my observations, the dimensional permeability increased during these transition periods, making movement between layers easier, more stable. As the sun descended behind the western ridge, I collected my equipment, flashlight, field books, measuring tape, chalk, and approached permeability zone 6, the courtyard location where I'd set up my theodolite earlier. Standing directly on the marker, I felt immediately that something was different. The air had that same dense quality I'd noticed inside Building C, and sound seemed muffled, as if I were underwater. I took a step forward, moving away from the marker in the direction my map indicated, and experienced a sensation I can only describe as sideways falling. A brief, vertiginous moment where my sense of direction became completely unreliable, where up and down seemed negotiable rather than absolute. Then I was standing in the courtyard still, but changed. The light was different, dimmer, coming from a sun that occupied a slightly different position, despite the fact that I could see my footprints in the dust leading directly back to where I'd stepped from. The buildings around me were the same buildings, but their weathering patterns were different, the rust on their siding darker, the erosion around their foundations more pronounced, as if I were seeing them after more decades of abandonment. I'd moved between spatial layers, crossed from one configuration into another through the permeability zone, stepping sideways through dimensions I couldn't perceive directly, but could navigate by feel and careful measurement. Building A, from this position, had a door where none had been visible before. It was located on the building's eastern face, exactly where my map suggested it would be, marked with the same faded placard style as the other entrances, but reading Deep Survey Access, authorized personnel only. I approached it carefully, testing the handle before applying force. It opened, unlocked, revealing a stairway descending into darkness. The stairs were metal grating, institutional and robust, leading down into spaces that couldn't exist beneath the building based on conventional spatial understanding. I descended slowly, counting steps, 23 before the stairs terminated at a landing, and a corridor that extended perpendicular to the stairway. This corridor was different from those I'd seen in the upper levels. The walls were rougher, showing exposed concrete with the marks of formwork still visible, and the ceiling was lower, perhaps 7 feet tall, creating a slightly oppressive sense of enclosure. Electrical conduits ran along the walls, bundled together with ties that had degraded over decades, and every 20 feet, a junction box with faded warning labels suggested this level had once been more extensively electrified than the upper stories. I followed the corridor, marking my path with chalk as I'd done before, aware that I was moving through spaces that existed in some relationship to the surface level, but weren't directly beneath it in any conventional sense. After perhaps 60 feet, the corridor opened into a larger space, a laboratory of some kind, equipped with long metal tables, storage cabinets, and several pieces of equipment I recognized as surveying instruments from various eras. The oldest was a 19th century transit theodolite, brass and glass mounted on a wooden tripod that should have rotted away decades ago, but appeared pristine. Beside it sat more modern instruments, wild theodolites from the 1960s, electronic total stations from the 1980s, and several pieces I couldn't identify, custom-built devices that combined surveying optics with other equipment I didn't recognize. All of the instruments were positioned facing the same direction, toward the laboratory's far wall, where a massive diagram had been painted directly onto the concrete. I approached it slowly, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was a map, but unlike any map I'd ever encountered, it showed Redstone Research Station in multiple dimensions simultaneously, using a projection system I couldn't identify. The 5 surface buildings appeared in the center, surrounded by concentric rings of additional structures, each ring representing a different spatial layer, connected by lines that indicated permeability zones. But the diagram didn't stop there. It continued outward, showing rings upon rings of structures extending into configurations so complex I couldn't follow their progression, until the outermost rings dissolved into abstract geometric patterns that might have been mathematical notation, or might have been something else entirely. Numbers were written beside many of the structures, measurements in units I didn't recognize, and threaded through everything, drawn in red paint that looked fresher than the rest of the diagram, was a path, the same route I'd been tracing, but continued much further, reaching into the station's deepest layers, terminating at a structure marked with the notation primary locus, causal origin. A sound behind me made me turn quickly. The figure I'd been tracking stood at the laboratory's entrance, no longer distant or ghostly but physically present, solid, real. It was a man, elderly, dressed in weathered field clothes that might have been olive drab decades ago but had faded to indeterminate gray. His face was deeply lined, weathered by time and conditions I couldn't imagine, but his eyes were alert, focused, possessing the peculiar intensity of someone who had been alone too long with thoughts too strange to share. "You're Marcus Holloway," he said. His voice was rough from disuse but clear enough. "Raymond said you'd come, said you were thorough enough to find your way down here." I found my voice with difficulty. "Gerald Kimmer." He smiled slightly, without much humor. "I was. 33 years ago, I was Gerald Kimmer, USGS surveyor assigned to document spatial anomalies at Redstone Research Station. Then I became something else. The man who stayed behind when everyone else left. The man who kept measuring when measurement became meaningless. The man who learned to navigate impossibilities." Dr. Iskov said the station was abandoned in 1990. It was, by everyone except me. And by abandoned, I mean they sealed it, contained it, tried to prevent what was happening here from spreading beyond the containment perimeter. He gestured at the diagram on the wall. "What you're surveying isn't a facility, Marcus. It's a phenomenon. A point where space itself has become unstable, where the normal geometric constraints that govern reality have relaxed enough that other configurations can manifest." He moved into the laboratory, walking past me to stand before the diagram. It started in 1967, when they built the station directly over a geological formation that shouldn't exist. Basalt columns that extend deeper than they should, that show symmetries and regularities impossible in natural formations. They thought it was just an interesting geological feature. They were wrong. It was a scar, a place where reality had been damaged long ago, where the boundaries between possible and impossible had grown thin. Damaged by what? Kimmer touched the diagram, tracing the path marked in red paint. "We don't know. Something geological, volcanic maybe, or something older, something that predates human understanding of geology." The station's research was ostensibly about studying volcanic activity, but the real research, the classified research, was about understanding and possibly exploiting the spatial anomalies. They wanted to know if the phenomenon could be controlled, directed, used. Used for what? Storage, communication, transportation. If you can create stable spaces that exist outside normal geometric constraints, that occupy positions only accessible through dimensional permeability zones, then you have something valuable. Something that could revolutionize how we think about distance, containment, security. He turned to face me, but they couldn't control it. The phenomenon grew stronger as they studied it, fed by their observation and measurement, expanding each time they took readings, creating new layers and connections. By 1990, the station occupied hundreds of spatial configurations simultaneously, and they were losing personnel. Losing them how? They'd enter the deeper levels, the extended layers, and wouldn't return. Not because they died, but because they became lost in topologies that didn't reliably connect back to baseline reality. They'd still be moving through the station, still alive, but in positions we couldn't reach, couldn't retrieve them from. I was the last surveyor they sent down to map the deep structures. I was supposed to establish safe routes, identify stable permeability zones that could be used for evacuation. Instead, I learned that the station didn't want to be evacuated. It wanted to be inhabited, understood, integrated with. The way he said this, with certainty rather than speculation, suggested he wasn't speaking metaphorically. "You're saying the station is conscious." "I'm saying the phenomenon that created it might be. or might operate according to principles so different from normal causation that it appears conscious when observed using frameworks designed for understanding conventional reality. It responds to measurement, Marcus. Every time you survey it, document it, map it, you're feeding it information about itself, allowing it to become more complex, more stable, more real. He gestured at his diagram. This map isn't just documenting what exists. It's helping to create what exists, giving form to possibilities that were previously undefined. I felt cold despite the laboratory's neutral temperature. Dr. Iskov knows this. That's why he hired me. He wants the station documented again, wants to see how it's evolved in 33 years. Raymond has been studying the phenomenon longer than anyone. He was the project director in 1990, the one who made the decision to seal the station rather than destroy it. He spent 3 decades analyzing the data we collected, developing theories about how spatial instabilities propagate, how they might be engineered or amplified. And now he wants fresh measurements, new data that shows how the station has progressed without human observation. But I have been observing it for 2 days now, taking measurements, creating maps. Kimmer nodded slowly. Yes, and you've noticed how the light in Building C has changed, how the figure you've been tracking has become more active, more visible. The station responds to observation by manifesting more completely. Your measurements are waking it up, reminding it that it exists to be measured. By the time you complete your survey, it will be more real, more persistent, more integrated with baseline reality than it was when you arrived. The implications were staggering and horrifying in equal measure. I need to stop, leave, refuse to complete the commission. You can't, not really, because you already know too much, have already seen too much. The station is in your awareness now, mapped in your mind even if not on paper. And once you've perceived it, once you've understood even partially how it operates, you become part of its topology. It exists now partially because you know it exists. Leaving won't change that. I sat heavily on one of the laboratory stools, my hands shaking slightly as I processed what Kimmer was telling me. What happened to the others? The personnel who got lost in the deep levels? They're still here, moving through the extended layers, navigating spaces that exist in increasingly remote configurations. Some of them have been here longer than me, lost in the initial expansions during the 1970s. They've adapted, learned to survive in geometries that no longer resemble anything we'd recognize as space. I encounter them occasionally, when my route through the permeability zones intersects with theirs. They're changed, Marcus. They've been shaped by existing in impossibilities for so long that they've become part of the phenomenon themselves. And you, how have you survived? By understanding that survival here requires accepting the station's rules rather than trying to impose my own. By mapping carefully and thoroughly, maintaining awareness of where baseline reality is even when I'm deep in layers that have no reliable connection to it. By treating the station not as a place to escape from, but as a place to understand, to live within, to become part of. He gestured at the diagram again. This map is 33 years of work, Marcus. 33 years of careful measurement, documentation, understanding. It's the most complete map of non-Euclidean space ever created by a human being. And it's still incomplete, still missing whole sections of the deep layers that I haven't been able to reach safely. Why stay? Why not return to baseline reality, to normal life? His expression was sad, touched with something like pity. Because I can't anymore. I've been here too long, navigated too many impossible spaces, integrated too deeply with the station's topology. My body, my awareness, my very existence has become adapted to geometries that don't exist in baseline reality. If I tried to return permanently, I'd be trying to force myself back into a spatial configuration I no longer fit. It would be like trying to force a four-dimensional object into three-dimensional space. Something would have to be cut away, sacrificed. And I'm no longer certain what parts of me could survive that sacrifice. The laboratory seemed suddenly smaller, more confining. I stood, moving toward the entrance, needing space to think, to process. Dr. Iskov hired me knowing I'd end up here, knowing I'd learn all this. Why? Because he needs a new surveyor, someone who can continue the mapping, who can document the station's progression, who can eventually replace me when I move too deep into the extended layers to maintain contact with baseline reality. You're not just mapping the station, Marcus. You're being recruited by it, integrated into its structure, prepared to become its next cartographer. I should have fled then. Should have run back through the corridor, up the stairs, across the courtyard to my car and away from this place and its impossible geometries. But Kimmer was right. I already knew too much, had already perceived too much. The station existed in my awareness now, a spatial puzzle I couldn't help but want to solve, a landscape too strange and compelling to abandon unmapped. "Show me," I said finally. "Show me the deep layers. Show me what you've been mapping for 33 years. Kimmer studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Follow carefully. And remember, the deeper we go, the less reliable baseline causation becomes. Cause and effect can separate, reverse, occur simultaneously. Your safety depends on maintaining awareness of your position, of the route back to layers with more conventional geometry. Lose that awareness, and you become lost in topologies that might never reconnect with anything you recognize as real." He moved to one of the custom surveying instruments, making adjustments with practiced precision. Through its eyepiece, I could see the laboratory's far wall rippling, becoming translucent, revealing a doorway that hadn't been present moments before. "Permeability zones can be induced," Kimmer explained, "created temporarily by precise measurements that focus the station's spatial instability into localized discontinuities. This door will remain open for approximately 10 minutes, long enough for us to pass through. After that, it will seal, and we'll need to use a different route to return." I followed him through the induced doorway into a corridor that shouldn't have existed, couldn't have existed, yet was undeniably present. The walls here were stranger than those I'd seen before, composed of material that looked like concrete but behaved like something more fluid, rippling slightly when I looked at it directly, stabilizing when I observed it peripherally. The ceiling varied in height continuously, rising and falling in slow waves that suggested it was responsive to something. Our presence, our observation, our measurement. "This is layer 3, Kimmer said, his voice taking on a lecturing quality, as if he'd waited decades for someone to teach. "It's still relatively stable, still maintains most conventional spatial relationships. You'll notice the materials are becoming less distinct, boundaries between objects less clearly defined. That's characteristic of the intermediate layers. Reality remains coherent but becomes increasingly negotiable." We walked perhaps 200 feet, though distance was becoming difficult to judge in space that wouldn't remain still long enough to measure accurately. The corridor branched multiple times, each branch leading to areas that Kimmer indicated with brief gestures. Laboratories, storage rooms, observation stations, all existing in this layer, all built or manifested through processes I couldn't begin to understand. We descended another stairway, this one spiraling in ways that suggested non-Euclidean architecture, turning through more than 360 degrees before reaching a landing that opened into a vast chamber. Layer 5, Kimmer said. The original research focus. This is where they were conducting the most sensitive measurements, where they first confirmed that space itself was mutable. The chamber was enormous, far larger than any space that could fit within the station's surface footprint. The ceiling rose into darkness beyond my flashlight's reach, and the walls curved away in multiple directions simultaneously, creating a sense of being at the center of something spherical and planar at the same time. Equipment filled the space, instruments I recognized as seismographs, magnetometers, gravimeters, all operating without apparent power sources, their needles and displays showing readings that fluctuated in complex patterns. They were measuring everything, Kimmer continued, walking between the instruments with familiar ease. Seismic activity, electromagnetic fields, gravitational variations, temporal gradients, trying to understand what force or phenomenon was causing the spatial anomalies. What they found was that the anomalies weren't caused by anything external. They were intrinsic to this location, properties of space itself here. The basalt formation beneath us isn't just rock. It's a structure, something built or grown, that extends down through normal geological layers into something else, something that exists at angles to conventional reality. He led me to the chamber's center, where a circular platform perhaps 20 feet in diameter rose slightly above the surrounding floor. The platform's surface was inscribed with markings, not quite mathematical notation, not quite writing, but something that suggested both. This is the primary locus, Kimmer said, the point where the spatial instability is strongest, where measurements become most unreliable and reality most mutable. Standing here, you can perceive multiple layers simultaneously. See the station as it exists in dozens of configurations at once. I stepped onto the platform carefully, and immediately my perception shifted in ways I can barely describe. I could see the chamber we stood in, but I could also see through it to other chambers, other spaces that occupied the same location, but in different geometric configurations. Some were larger, extending into vastness that my mind couldn't process. Others were smaller, compressed into confining geometries that suggested claustrophobia even from external observation. And threaded through all of them, visible as glowing lines of connection, were the permeability zones, the pathways that linked these impossibly different spaces into a single, coherent structure. I could see Kimmer beside me, but also Kimmer in dozens of other positions, other times, moving through his 33-year survey of the deep layers. I could see the lost personnel he'd mentioned, figures moving through remote configurations, their forms distorted by adaptation to non-Euclidean geometries. I could see the basalt formation beneath us, extending downward through rock and magma and planetary crust into something that wasn't geological at all, something ancient and deliberate and patient. And I could see myself, both as I was in that moment and as I would become, a figure like Kimmer, weathered and isolated, moving through impossible spaces with practiced ease, maintaining the endless survey of phenomena that wouldn't stay measured, mapping realities that changed each time they were documented. You see now, Kimmer said quietly. You understand what you've committed to by coming here, by accepting Dr. Iskov's commission. The station needs cartographers, Marcus. It needs observers who can document its existence, who can give form to its infinite possibilities through careful measurement. Without us, it's just potential, undefined and unstable. With us, It becomes real, persistent, capable of existing across multiple geometric configurations simultaneously. I stepped back from the platform, breaking the multi-layered vision, returning to the single, coherent present. My head ached with the memory of perceiving too much, of holding incompatible spatial relationships in awareness simultaneously. I didn't commit to anything except a 2-week surveying job. You committed the moment you entered Building C and saw the figure moving through impossible corridors. You committed when you set up your theodolite over a permeability zone marker and began measuring the station's extended topology. You committed when you followed me down here instead of fleeing back to your car and away from this place. He turned to face me fully, his expression serious. The station is in your mind now, Marcus. Mapped in your awareness, understood partially, perceived as real. That perception has weight, has consequence. It helps anchor the station into existence, makes it more than just a possibility. You can't unmake that perception, can't choose to forget what you've seen. The only choice you have now is whether to continue mapping carefully, systematically, maintaining awareness of baseline reality, or whether to resist, to deny what you know is true, and risk becoming lost in topologies you don't understand. That's not a choice, that's coercion. That's consequence. You chose to accept the commission, chose to come here, chose to investigate rather than retreat. Those choices have led you here, to this understanding. Now you have to choose how to proceed from this position. I wanted to argue, to insist that I could walk away, that I maintained agency and autonomy, that I wasn't bound by the station's needs or Dr. Iskov's plans. But I couldn't convince myself, couldn't ignore the truth of what Kimmer was saying. I'd been changed by observing this place, shaped by the measurements I'd taken, integrated into its structure through the simple act of perceiving it accurately. What does Dr. Iskov want? I asked finally. What's the purpose of continuing the survey? Understanding, control, the ability to predict how spatial instabilities propagate and evolve. Raymond believes that phenomena like this aren't unique, that there are other locations where reality has become mutable, where space responds to measurement and observation. He wants to develop theories, methodologies, tools for working with non-Euclidean geometries. And that requires data, detailed measurements of how the station has evolved over 33 years without active observation. And once I've provided that data, once I've completed the survey, then you'll have a choice to make. You can try to return to baseline reality, to resume your normal life, carrying the awareness of what exists here but not actively participating in its mapping. That's possible, though difficult. The station will pull at your attention, manifest in your thoughts, create a persistent dissonance between what you know to be true and what consensus reality claims is possible. Lord. Or you can stay, like I did. Become the station's cartographer, the person who maintains the endless documentation of its evolving topology, who maps the deep layers and charts the permeability zones, and ensures that this impossible place remains coherent and accessible. It's lonely work, isolating, demanding, but it's also the most important surveying that's ever been done, the most complete mapping of space that violates every conventional geometric principle. I thought about my life in Portland, my small apartment, my collection of antique surveying equipment, my profession that paid just well enough to sustain a modest existence. I thought about the comfortable predictability of mapping properties that stayed where I left them, of landscapes that obeyed Euclidean geometry, of spaces that could be trusted to remain consistent between observations. And I thought about the map I'd begun creating, The layered transparency showing redstone research stations, multiple spatial configurations. I thought about the deep layers I'd just perceived from the primary locus, the infinite complexity waiting to be documented, the mathematical beauty of geometries that couldn't exist but did. I thought about being the person who understood this place more completely than anyone else, who could navigate its impossibilities with Kimmer's practiced ease, who could look at contradictory spaces and see not chaos but elegant pattern. I need time, I said. I need to complete the basic survey, document what I can from the surface layers, provide Dr. Iskov with the data he's requested. After that, I'll decide. Kimmer nodded slowly. That's reasonable. More reasonable than I was. I made my decision without understanding what I was choosing, without recognizing that staying here would make returning impossible. Take your time, Marcus. Map carefully. And remember that the deeper you go, the more you understand, the harder it becomes to imagine existing anywhere else. He led me back through the chamber, up the impossible stairway, through corridors that shifted and rippled as we passed. We emerged into the laboratory where we'd started, though I couldn't have retraced the route we'd taken. Time had passed differently in the deep layers. What felt like an hour had been nearly 4 according to my watch, though I couldn't be certain my watch was measuring time accurately in space that didn't respect conventional causation. I'll continue my route, Kimmer said, moving through the permeability zones, maintaining the measurements that keep the deep layers stable. You'll see me occasionally, in windows or through theodolite lenses, moving through spaces that appear impossible from baseline observation. Don't be disturbed. I'm not a ghost or a manifestation of the anomaly. I'm just a surveyor doing my work, the same as you. He walked to the laboratory's entrance, paused, and turned back. One more thing, Marcus. The station responds to expectation as much as observation. What you believe about it influences what it becomes. If you approach it with fear, with the expectation of danger and incoherence, it will manifest those qualities. If you approach it with systematic curiosity, with the expectation that its complexity can be understood and documented, it will reveal its patterns more clearly. Your attitude matters here, in ways it doesn't in normal surveying. Then he was gone, vanishing into the corridor with a fluidity that suggested he'd learned to navigate the station's geometry at an instinctive level, moving between configurations as easily as I might walk between rooms. I remained in the laboratory for perhaps 20 minutes, studying Kimmer's diagram, committing its structures to memory. Then I retraced my steps back to the stairway, up to the courtyard, across the permeability zone to my car. The transition back to baseline reality was disorienting, like surfacing from deep water, requiring adjustment to different pressures and different rules. The sun had moved further across the sky than 4 hours should account for, suggesting temporal distortion in the deep layers, time flowing at different rates in different geometric configurations. It was late afternoon now, the light taking on the golden quality that preceded twilight. I had perhaps 2 hours before dark, 2 hours to work in baseline reality before the dimensional permeability increased and the station manifested more completely. I spent that time refining my survey, taking additional measurements from the surface permeability zones, adding detail to my layered map. The work was soothing, familiar, requiring precision and focus that left little room for existential contemplation. I documented angles and distances, noted discrepancies and anomalies, built a data set that was rigorous and thorough despite describing impossibilities. As twilight approached, I set up my theodolite at permeability zone 6 again, positioning it to observe building C. The lights began their pulse, right on schedule, and through the theodolite's lens I watched Kimmer move through the building's impossible interior, following his 33-year-old route, maintaining the measurements that gave structure to chaos. I understood now what Dr. Iskov wanted from me. Not just data, but verification that the phenomenon persisted, that the station remained accessible and documentable, that another cartographer could learn to navigate its topology. I was being tested, evaluated, prepared for a role I hadn't known existed when I'd accepted the commission. The question was whether I would accept that role, whether I would choose to become what Kimmer had become, a permanent observer, a cartographer of impossibilities, a person who existed partially outside baseline reality in order to map spaces that violated its rules. I documented observations until full dark, then retreated to my car for another night of fractured sleep and dreams of changing geometries. But this time, the dreams were different, more ordered, more systematic, suggesting that my mind was beginning to adapt, to develop frameworks for processing spatial relationships that couldn't exist but did. I woke before dawn, not refreshed exactly, but with a sense of clarity I hadn't possessed before. I had 11 days remaining in my 2-week commission, 11 days to complete the survey and make a decision about what came next. I would use those days well, mapping thoroughly, documenting carefully, understanding as completely as possible what I was being asked to join. The second week of surveying was different from the first. I was no longer discovering the station's anomalies. I was confirming them, refining my understanding, building a comprehensive model of its multi-layered topology. I spent mornings in baseline reality, taking measurements from the surface permeability zones, documenting how the visible structures related to their extended counterparts. Afternoons I spent in the intermediate layers, following Kimmer's maps into layers 2 through 4, charting corridors and chambers that existed in geometries increasingly divergent from Euclidean norms. I encountered the lost personnel on my 4th day in the deep layers. They were moving through layer 4, 3 figures whose forms had been reshaped by decades in non-Euclidean space, their proportions wrong in subtle ways that suggested they'd adapted to different dimensional constraints. They didn't acknowledge my presence directly, but I felt them observing me, evaluating whether I was permanent or merely visiting, whether I would stay like them or return to baseline reality like so many others had attempted. I developed routines, procedures for navigating between layers safely. Always maintain awareness of the route back to baseline reality. Always mark transitions with chalk or string. Always carry multiple light sources. Always trust measurements over perception when the two conflicted. These rules, combined with Kimmer's maps and my own accumulating experience, allowed me to explore deeper than I'd initially thought possible, to document layers that existed in geometries so strange that describing them required inventing new notation. By day 8, I'd mapped 9 distinct layers, identified 23 permeability zones, and created a comprehensive survey that showed Redstone Research Station as a nested series of impossible spaces extending through dimensions I couldn't name but could measure. The work was the most challenging I'd ever undertaken, requiring every skill I'd developed over 11 years of professional cartography, plus new skills I was inventing as I progressed. It was also, I had to admit, the most satisfying work I'd ever done. There was a purity to it, a directness of relationship between observation and documentation that my usual commissions lacked. I wasn't mapping to establish property boundaries or create decorative representations. I was mapping to understand, to give form to phenomena that would remain formless without careful measurement, to create order from chaos through the simple act of precise documentation. On day 9, I descended to layer 7, deeper than Kimmer had indicated was safe for someone with my limited experience. The geometry there was profoundly disturbing, with multiple floors occupying the same elevation, with corridors that looped back on themselves while somehow advancing forward, with spaces that were simultaneously vast and confining. I lasted only 40 minutes before the dissonance became overwhelming, before I felt my grasp on baseline spatial relationships beginning to slip. I retreated carefully, methodically, using my marked route and my measurements to guide me back through layers that grew progressively more conventional, until I emerged into the courtyard, gasping and disoriented, but intact. Kimmer found me there, appearing from Building A with the timing that suggested he'd been monitoring my progress. "Layer 7 is not for beginners," he said, neither critical nor sympathetic, just stating fact. "It requires adaptation, time spent in intermediate layers until your awareness expands to accommodate geometries that contradictory. You pushed too far too fast." I needed to understand how deep the phenomenon extends. It extends infinitely, Marcus, or near enough that infinity becomes a useful approximation. The station isn't just a finite set of layers, it's a fractal expansion, each layer containing the seeds of further layers, extending through dimensional configurations that become increasingly remote from anything resembling baseline reality. I've been mapping it for 33 years, and I've barely scratched its depths. You won't map it completely in 11 days, or 11 years, or perhaps ever. I sat on the courtyard concrete, letting my heart rate slow, my perception stabilize. Then what's the point? If it's infinite, unmappable, why continue surveying? Because the act of surveying is what gives it structure. Without measurement, without documentation, the deep layers remain undefined, potential rather than actual. Our mapping doesn't just describe what exists, it helps determine what exists, collapsing infinite possibility into finite configuration through the act of observation. We're not discovering the station, Marcus. We're creating it layer by layer, measurement by measurement. The implications of this were staggering. Then Dr. Iskov isn't just studying a phenomenon. He's engineering one, using surveyors to expand and stabilize a spatial anomaly that grows more complex with each observation. Yes, though engineering suggests more control than he actually possesses, the station responds to measurement, but not always predictably. Sometimes new layers manifest in unexpected configurations. Sometimes permeability zones shift or seal. Sometimes the deep structures reorganize themselves according to principles we don't understand. Raymond provides framework and methodology, but the station itself determines how it grows. Why? What purpose does expanding it serve? Kimmer sat beside me, his weathered face thoughtful. That depends on who you ask. Raymond would tell you it's about understanding fundamental aspects of reality, about developing theoretical frameworks for working with non-Euclidean space, about advancing human knowledge into domains previously inaccessible. He'd be partly telling the truth. He genuinely believes this research is important, world-changing even. And the rest of the truth. The rest is about power, about possessing unique knowledge, unique capabilities. If you understand how to navigate and manipulate non-Euclidean space, You have access to possibilities that others don't, storage that occupies no physical footprint, transit routes that bypass conventional distance, containment that can't be breached by normal means. These capabilities have obvious applications: commercial, military, scientific. Raymond has been cultivating this phenomenon for decades because he believes it will eventually give him leverage, influence, resources. And you're helping him. I'm helping the station. There's a difference. Raymond wants to control it, direct it toward his purposes. I want to understand it, document it, give it coherence through careful mapping. My motivations are different, even if our methods align. We sat in silence for several minutes, watching afternoon shadows lengthen across the courtyard. Finally, I asked, "What happens if I refuse? If I complete the basic survey, provide Dr. Iskov with the data he's requested, but decline to continue as the station's cartographer? Then someone else will eventually take the role. Raymond has been searching for the right person for years, someone with technical skill, spatial intuition, and the temperament to work in isolation with phenomena that violate common sense. You're not his first candidate. You probably won't be his last if you decline. But the station needs cartographers, Marcus. It needs observers who can stabilize its expansion through systematic documentation. Without us, it remains unstable, dangerous, likely to collapse or expand chaotically in ways that could affect baseline reality." That sounds like threat. It's consequence. The station exists now, manifested through decades of measurement and observation. It won't simply vanish if we stop mapping it. More likely, it will continue expanding without structure, creating layers that don't connect reliably to anything, spawning permeability zones that open in unpredictable locations, potentially spreading its spatial instability beyond the containment perimeter. Continued surveying isn't about serving Raymond's ambitions. It's about maintaining coherence in something that's already been brought into existence. I understood what he was telling me. I'd been recruited not just to document the station, but to take responsibility for it, to become one of the few people keeping its impossible geometry organized and accessible. It was a burden disguised as an opportunity, a lifetime commitment presented as a 2-week commission. "I need to think," I said. "I need the remaining days to complete my survey and decide whether I can accept what you're describing." Kimmer nodded and stood, preparing to return to his eternal route through the permeability zones. "That's fair. But Marcus, understand that thinking about it, contemplating it, holding it in your awareness, that's already a form of participation. The station is in your mind now, mapped partially, understood incompletely. That perception has weight. You're already helping to stabilize it, already functioning as its cartographer whether you formally accept the role or not." He walked away, and I watched him disappear into Building A, moving between visible and invisible with practiced ease. Then I returned to my car, retrieved my field books, and spent the evening reviewing everything I documented, looking for patterns or insights I might have missed. What I found was disturbing in its clarity. My measurements showed the station expanding, not uniformly but systematically, with new structural elements appearing in layers I'd surveyed previously, with permeability zones shifting to create connections I hadn't documented before. The expansion wasn't random. It was responsive, shaped by my observation, growing in directions my attention focused on, manifesting structures in configurations my measurements suggested might exist. Kimmer was right. I wasn't just documenting the station. I was participating in its creation, my careful surveys helping to determine what possibilities became actualities, my maps giving form to spaces that remained undefined until I measured them into existence. I spent days 10 and 11 completing my survey of the surface and intermediate layers, compiling the data Dr. Iskov had requested. The work went quickly now, my movements through permeability zones becoming fluid, my ability to read the station's geometry improving with each transition. I was adapting, my mind developing frameworks for processing spatial relationships that would have been incomprehensible 2 weeks earlier. I also spent time with Kimmer, following him through sections of his route, learning the deep rhythms of the station's topology. He showed me how permeability zones could be induced through precise measurement combinations, how to recognize when layers were becoming unstable, how to navigate by feel when visual cues became unreliable. He was teaching me, preparing me, investing his knowledge in someone who might continue the work after he moved too deep into the extended layers to maintain regular contact with baseline reality. On my final evening, I stood at Permeability Zone 6 as twilight approached, watching Building C's lights begin their pulse. I'd completed my survey, documented everything Dr. Iskov had requested, and more, created maps that showed Redstone Research Station in unprecedented detail. I had enough data to satisfy the commission, enough evidence to confirm that the phenomenon persisted and remained accessible. I also had a decision to make. I could pack my equipment, drive back to Portland, deliver my maps to Dr. Iskov, and attempt to resume my normal life. I'd carry the awareness of what existed here, the knowledge of impossible geometries and spaces that violated every principle I'd been trained to trust. That awareness would create persistent dissonance, a permanent gap between what I knew and what consensus reality claimed was possible. But I'd be free, independent, able to pursue whatever life I chose within the constraints of baseline reality. Or I could stay, accept the role of cartographer, continue the work Kimmer had maintained for 33 years, dedicate myself to mapping and understanding the station's infinite complexity. It would be isolating, demanding, strange beyond measure, but it would also be important, necessary, the most complete documentation of non-Euclidean space ever attempted by a human being. I thought about my apartment in Portland, my comfortable routines, my profession that paid modestly but sufficiently. I thought about friends I saw occasionally, family I spoke with rarely, connections that were present but not deep, relationships that would persist whether I returned or not. And I thought about the station, its nested layers extending through dimensions I was only beginning to understand, its permeability zones creating pathways through impossibilities, its fundamental wrongness that was also somehow right, elegant, beautiful in its violation of conventional constraints. I thought about standing on the primary locus, perceiving multiple configurations simultaneously, seeing the station as it truly was rather than as baseline observation suggested. I thought about the satisfaction of precise measurement, of documentation that captured truth despite impossibility, of maps that gave form to phenomena that resisted all attempts to remain formless. I made my decision not through rational analysis, but through recognition, understanding suddenly and completely what I'd known at some level since entering Building C and seeing corridors that extended further than they should. I belonged here. Not because I was trapped or coerced, but because this place offered something I'd been seeking without knowing it. Work that mattered absolutely, that couldn't be delegated or approximated. that required every skill I possessed plus skills I would develop through decades of practice. I walked to my car, but not to pack equipment. Instead, I retrieved the most detailed of my maps, the layered transparency showing the station's multiple configurations, and carried it to Building A. I descended to the laboratory where Kimmer and I had first spoken, found him there updating his diagram with fresh measurements, and spread my map on one of the metal tables. "I'm staying," I said. "I accept the role. Teach me everything you know about navigating the deep layers, about maintaining stability, about surviving in geometries that don't connect reliably to baseline reality. Teach me to be the cartographer this place needs." Kimmer studied my map in silence, tracing its layers with one weathered finger, noting the details I'd captured, the patterns I'd identified. Finally, he looked up, and his expression was complex. Relief, sadness, solidarity, warning, all present simultaneously. "It's a lifetime commitment, Marcus. Longer than lifetime, potentially. Time flows differently in the deep layers, and exposure to non-Euclidean geometry affects aging in ways we don't fully understand. I've been here 33 years by baseline reckoning, but my body suggests perhaps 20 years of subjective time. You'll outlive everyone you know, everyone you care about, by decades or centuries. You'll watch the world change from this isolated position, connected to it only through whatever communications Dr. Iskov maintains. You'll become something not quite human, adapted to impossibilities in ways that make baseline existence increasingly difficult." "I understand. Do you? Do you understand that there's no retirement from this work? No return to normal life once you've committed fully? That you'll die here eventually, or become so integrated with the station's topology that the distinction between cartographer and mapped territory becomes meaningless? I understand that I'm choosing to spend my life doing the most important surveying work that's ever been attempted. That I'm accepting responsibility for maintaining coherence in a phenomenon that's already been manifested and won't simply vanish if ignored. That I'm becoming part of something larger and stranger than anything consensus reality contains." Kimmer was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. Then we begin properly. The survey you've completed is preliminary surface work. The real mapping starts in layer 8 and continues downward into configurations where baseline causation becomes optional, where time and space separate into independent variables, where the very concept of place requires redefinition. I'll guide you for as long as I can, until I move too deep to maintain regular contact. After that, you'll continue alone, following the work where it leads, documenting what you find, giving form to possibilities that exceed human imagination." He returned to his diagram, adding notations in the margins, marking pathways I should follow, warning me away from regions where the geometry had become too unstable. "We have years of work ahead, Marcus. Decades, probably. The station continues expanding, manifesting new layers faster than we can document them, responding to our observation by becoming more complex, more extensive. We'll never map it completely, never reach its deepest structures or its furthest extensions. But we'll try. We'll measure and document and understand as much as any human consciousness can hold, and in doing so, we'll give it the structure it needs to remain coherent." "What about Dr. Iskov? What about delivering the survey data he requested?" "We'll send it. Everything you've documented, all your measurements and maps and observations. He'll be pleased. The data confirms the phenomenon's persistence and demonstrates that new cartographers can be recruited and trained. He'll continue providing resources, maintaining the containment perimeter, ensuring we have supplies and communication equipment. In return, we'll provide him with information about how spatial instabilities propagate, how non-Euclidean geometries can be navigated and potentially exploited. It's a fair arrangement, mutually beneficial even if our motivations differ. I spent that night in the laboratory rather than my car, beginning to shift my base of operations from baseline reality to the intermediate layers where most of my work would occur. Kimmer showed me how to establish a permanent camp in Layer 3, where the geometry was stable enough for reliable habitation, but strange enough that I'd begin adapting to non-Euclidean space. The next morning, if morning was the right term for the arbitrary awakening point I chose in spaces where day and night were nominal rather than actual, I returned to my car one final time. I retrieved essential equipment, personal items I couldn't replace, documentation I wanted preserved. I also composed a message to Dr. Iskov, brief and professional, confirming that I was remaining at the station to continue the survey, accepting the role of cartographer, committing to the work for however long it required. I included my completed maps, my field books full of measurements, my observations about how the station had evolved in 33 years. I noted the expansion of intermediate layers, the increased stability of permeability zones, the manifestation of new structures in configurations Kimmer hadn't documented. I provided recommendations for future research, suggestions for methodologies that might yield better data, warnings about regions where the geometry had become dangerously unstable. Then I sealed the package, carried it to my car, and left it on the driver's seat with instructions for Dr. Iskov's retrieval team: how to find the vehicle, how to extract the materials without entering the station's active zones, how to avoid the permeability zones during periods of dimensional flux. I took one last look at my Subaru, at the baseline reality it represented, at the life I was leaving behind. Then I turned away and walked back to Building A, descended the impossible stairway to the laboratory, and began my apprenticeship in earnest. That was 6 months ago by my best estimate, though time is difficult to track with precision in spaces where its flow is inconsistent. I've mapped 12 layers now, documented 47 permeability zones, created comprehensive charts of the station's topology down to geometries that begin approaching true non-Euclidean configurations. I've encountered the lost personnel numerous times, learned to recognize individuals by their adapted forms, established basic communication despite the profound changes they've undergone. Kimmer has begun spending more time in Layer 9 and beyond, preparing for his eventual transition to the deep structures, transferring his knowledge to me through intensive teaching sessions in the intermediate layers. I'm learning quickly, my mind adapting to spatial relationships that would have been incomprehensible when I arrived, developing intuitions about how the station's geometry operates that bypass conscious analysis. I've also begun noticing changes in myself. Small things initially, an ability to estimate distances in non-Euclidean space without measuring, a tendency to perceive baseline reality as simplified rather than normal, a growing comfort with contradictions that would have troubled me before. I'm adapting, just as Kimmer warned I would, becoming something shaped by the impossibilities I spend my days documenting. Dr. Iskov sends communications occasionally, delivered to a supply cache in the surface levels by assistants who don't enter deep enough to experience the spatial anomalies directly. His messages are brief, professional, requesting specific data or clarification about observations I've reported. He never asks if I regret my decision, never offers the option of returning to baseline reality. I think he knows that option has already closed, that I've integrated too deeply with the station's topology to extract cleanly. I don't regret it. The work is as demanding and isolating as Kimmer described, but it's also profoundly satisfying in ways my previous life never was. I'm creating something unprecedented, a comprehensive map of non-Euclidean space, a document that captures impossibilities with precision and clarity. Future cartographers, if any come after me, will build on this foundation, extending the survey deeper, documenting layers I'll never reach. The station continues expanding. New structures manifest in layers I've already mapped, requiring constant revision and updates to my documentation. Permeability zones shift and multiply, creating pathways that didn't exist yesterday, sealing routes I'd considered permanent. It's like mapping a living thing, something that grows and changes and responds to observation by becoming more complex. I see Kimmer less frequently now. He's moved his base to layer 10, spending weeks at a time in geometries so strange that returning to the intermediate layers requires days of readjustment. When we do meet, usually in the laboratory or at one of the stable permeability zones, he shares observations from the deep structures, fragmentary, difficult to process, suggesting that the station's furthest extensions exist in states that can barely be described using language designed for baseline reality. He's warned me that he'll eventually move too deep to return, that he'll become one of the lost personnel, adapted to geometries so remote from Euclidean space that he can no longer navigate back to anything I'd recognize as a place. When that happens, I'll be the station's sole active cartographer, responsible for maintaining the measurements that keep its expansion coherent, for documenting the layers that continue manifesting, for giving form to possibilities that would otherwise remain undefined. I'm ready for that responsibility, or as ready as anyone can be for work that has no precedent, no training manual, no established procedures. I have Kimmer's maps, my own accumulating experience, and the understanding that precision matters here more than anywhere else. That careful measurement is what transforms chaos into structure, what makes the impossible navigable. The station is patient. It has existed in potential for longer than human civilization, waiting for observers capable of documenting it into actuality. Now it has us, Kimmer moving into its deepest reaches, me maintaining its intermediate structures, future cartographers who will continue the work after I move too deep to return. It will outlast us all, continuing to expand through dimensions we can't name, manifesting layers we'll never map, existing as a monument to the mutability of space and the power of careful observation. I spend my days measuring, documenting, creating maps that capture truth about realities most people will never encounter. I navigate between layers with increasing ease, reading the station's geometry the way I once read conventional landscapes, finding beauty in its violations of Euclidean principles. I maintain the permeability zones, ensure their stability, document their shifts and evolutions. And I think about Dr. Iskov's question, the one he never explicitly asked, but that underlies every communication. Was the station here before we began measuring it, or did our measurements bring it into existence? Did we discover this phenomenon or create it through the act of observation? I don't know the answer. Perhaps there is no answer, or perhaps the question itself is based on false assumptions about causation and sequence. What I know is that the station exists now, documented and mapped and real, occupying spaces that violate every geometric principle but that can be navigated and understood through careful measurement. And I know that I'm here, Marcus Holloway, cartographer of impossibilities, documenting phenomena that transform with each observation, creating maps that will never be complete but that capture essential truths about how space behaves when conventional constraints relax. The station waits in the high desert, patient and wrong, extending through dimensions that can't be named into configurations that exceed description. Its lights pulse in windows that exist in multiple layers simultaneously, marking permeabilities that connect impossibilities. Its corridors curve through angles that bypass distance, leading to places that occupy the same location, but in different geometric configurations. And somewhere in its depths, in layers so remote from baseline reality that returning might be impossible, the lost personnel continue their existence, adapted beyond recognition, navigating geometries that would shatter minds less thoroughly changed. I'll join them eventually. Decades from now, or centuries, or next week, time is negotiable here, and predictions become unreliable. I'll move deeper into the extended layers, following the work where it leads, documenting structures that exist at increasingly impossible angles to conventional space. And eventually, I'll move too deep to return, becoming another figure moving through impossibilities, another cartographer who chose understanding over comfort, precision over safety, truth over the convenient fictions consensus reality maintains. But that's for later. For now, I have layers to map, measurements to take, documentation to maintain. The station continues manifesting, continues expanding, continues responding to observation by becoming more complex and extensive. And I continue measuring it, giving it form through careful documentation, creating maps that transform infinite possibility into finite configuration through the simple act of precise attention. The work continues. The work is endless. The work is everything. And in the deepest layers, in geometries so strange they barely constitute space at all, something ancient and patient continues, whatever growth or process brought the station into potential millennia ago. Something that might be geological or might be conscious or might be neither, that exists outside our frameworks for understanding cause and effect, that manifests through dimensions we can measure but can't perceive directly. We map it anyway. We document it anyway. We give it structure anyway because that's what cartographers do. We transform unknown territories into known ones, chaos into order, possibility into actuality, through the careful application of measurement and the patient work of documentation. The station exists because we observe it. We observe it because it exists. The causation is circular, self-referential, impossible to untangle. But the maps are real, the measurements are precise, and the work continues. That was 6 months ago. Or 6 years. Time is difficult now.